On the morning of May 5th, 2009, a father called his neighbor a police detective, in a panic saying he could not reach his wife. After coming home from the gym, what officers found inside that quiet suburban home in Illinois would shock investigators, who had seen almost everything. A mother and her two young sons strangled in their own beds, red spray-painted words, covered the walls warning of punishment, and watching eyes as if some outsider had marked this family for death. The husband told police he had been receiving terrifying threats for months. Threats aimed at his family because of his high-profile job, protecting a famous television preacher. It looked like the work of an obsessed stranger, a killer stalking a perfect family from the shadows. But investigators noticed something strange almost immediately. The husband did not ask how his wife and children had died. He barely reacted at all. And when detectives began digging deeper into those threatening messages, something impossible started to surface. The threats were not coming from a stranger. They were coming from somewhere much closer, somewhere inside that very house. Drop a comment and let us know where you are watching from, and if you are new here, go ahead and subscribe. To understand how a devoted family man became the center of one of Illinois' most shocking murder investigations, we need to go back to who Christopher Coleman really was. Before that terrible morning in May, Coleman grew up with discipline running through nearly everything he did. He served as a Marine in his younger years, learning structure and control that would later define his public image completely. He carried himself with the kind of confidence that made people trust him instantly. Tall, composed, always in command of a room. That same discipline eventually led him into an unusual and highly respected career. He became the head of security for Joyce Meyer Ministries, one of the largest televangelist organizations in the entire country. It was a position that paid well over $100,000 a year. It required constant travel across the globe, protecting a woman whose sermons were watched by millions. To everyone around him, Chris seemed like the perfect example of faith, family, and success working together in harmony. At home, he had built a life that looked just as picture-perfect as his career. His wife, Sheri, was warm and devoted, the kind of mother who built her entire world around her children. Together, they were raising two young sons, Garett, who was 11, and Gavin, who was 9. Photographs from that time show a smiling suburban family living in Columbia, Illinois, a quiet, close-knit town where neighbors knew each other by name and children played safely outside until the streetlights came on. Chris often spoke about his faith. He attended church regularly and worked for one of the most recognizable religious figures in America. To the outside world, there was nothing that suggested anything was wrong inside that home. But long before anyone suspected, something had already begun changing beneath the surface. In late 2008, Chris started a secret relationship with a woman named Tara Lintz. She worked as a cocktail waitress in Florida and had actually known Sheri for years before this began. What started as private messages slowly grew into something far more serious. Text messages turned into phone calls. Phone calls turned into secret meetings during his frequent work trips. The two began planning a future together, as if his marriage to Sheri simply did not exist. Around this same time, something else started happening. Frightening messages began arriving at the Coleman household. At first, it was just a few unsettling emails. Then, threatening letters started showing up at their front door, written by someone who claimed to despise Joyce Meyer and everything she preached. The messages grew more specific and more disturbing with each passing week. They spoke of punishment. They spoke of watching the family closely. They hinted at violence against people Chris loved the most. Naturally, Chris reported every single one of these threats to local police, treating them as proof that someone dangerous was targeting his family because of his high-profile job. Investigators took the threats seriously given who he worked for. A neighbor even installed a security camera, aimed directly at the Coleman mailbox, hoping to catch whoever was leaving these letters in the act. As the months passed, the tone of these warnings grew darker and more urgent. By April of 2009, one message arrived that felt different from all the others. It read like a final countdown, a warning that something terrible was coming and there would be no more chances left. Sheri grew increasingly anxious. Friends later said she confided that she believed Chris wanted out of their marriage, but feared losing his prestigious job and reputation if he ever asked for a divorce. She had no idea just how right she was about him wanting an escape, nor did she understand how far he might be willing to go to get one. As May approached, the threats had reached a fever pitch. The family felt like they were living under constant surveillance from an enemy they could not see. What none of them could have imagined is that the person sending those chilling warnings was not some outside threat lurking in the shadows. He was already living inside their home, sleeping beside Sheri every single night. And in just a matter of days, everything building quietly behind the scenes was about to explode into a nightmare that would leave an entire community searching for answers. The morning of May 5th, 2009 began like any other for Chris Coleman. He told people he woke up early and headed to the gym for his usual workout, leaving Sheri and the boys still asleep inside their home on Robert Drive. He claimed he left the house sometime around 5:40 or 5:45 that morning, heading out into the quiet, pre-dawn darkness of Columbia, Illinois. But investigators would later discover something deeply troubling about that timeline. The medical examiner determined that Sheri, Garett, and Gavin had already died before 5 in the morning, likely closer to 3, which meant that whatever Chris said happened during his supposed gym trip could not explain the hours that mattered most. When he returned home, Chris said he could not reach Sheri by phone, which worried him enough to call his neighbor, Justin Barlow, who happened to be a Columbia police detective. At 6:43 that morning, Barlow arrived at the house and the two men entered together, climbing through an open basement window since the doors appeared locked from the inside. What they found upstairs would haunt Barlow for the rest of his career. Sheri lay lifeless in the primary bedroom. Down the hall, 11-year-old Garett and 9-year-old Gavin were found the same way in their own beds. All three had been strangled. Spray painted across the walls in bright red letters were disturbing messages. Words like punished and phrases claiming, "I am always watching," filled the hallways, alongside crude threats and warnings that seemed to confirm exactly what Chris had been telling police for months. It looked at first exactly like the nightmare scenario the family had feared, a stranger obsessed with destroying them, finally making good on every threat that had been building since late the previous year. But Detective Barlow noticed something that did not sit right with him almost immediately. As the two men moved through the house, searching room to room, Chris never once asked how his family had died. He did not ask if there had been a break-in. He did not ask whether they had suffered. His reaction seemed strangely flat, almost detached from the horror unfolding right in front of him. It was a small detail, the kind of thing that might mean nothing in the chaos of tragedy. But for a trained investigator like Barlow, it was impossible to ignore. As word spread through Columbia that morning, the entire town went into shock. This was not the kind of place where triple homicides happened. Neighbors who had watched the Coleman boys ride their bikes down quiet streets just days earlier now stood outside their homes, struggling to process what had occurred inside that house. Reporters descended on the small Illinois town, almost immediately drawn by the chilling detail of the spray-painted walls and the eerie coincidence that Chris worked in security for one of the most famous religious broadcasters in the country. At first, much of the public sympathy rested squarely with Chris. Here was a grieving husband and father who had been warning authorities for months that someone wanted to hurt his family. The threatening letters, the unsettling emails, the neighbor who had installed a camera on the mailbox, hoping to catch whoever kept leaving those warnings. All of it seemed to build toward this exact horrifying outcome. But behind the scenes, investigators were beginning to ask questions that would soon unravel everything. Why would an outside attacker take the time to spray paint elaborate messages on multiple walls instead of simply fleeing the scene? Why was there no sign of forced entry anywhere in the house except for that conveniently unlocked basement window And most disturbing of all, why did the emotional reaction of the supposedly devastated husband feel so oddly muted compared to what anyone would expect from a man who just lost his entire family? Detectives began quietly pulling records almost immediately. Phone data, email accounts, internet history. They wanted to trace exactly where those threatening messages had originated from before they made any assumptions about who might be responsible. What they found in the days that followed would completely shatter the narrative Chris had spent months building. Because those emails claiming to despise Joyce Meyer Ministries, those letters warning of punishment and violence, they had not come from some anonymous stranger hiding in the shadows at all. Digital forensic experts traced the messages directly back to an IP address connected to Chris, Coleman's own laptop, and buried within personal documents he had written for entirely unrelated purposes. Investigators found the exact same distinctive misspelling that appeared throughout the threatening letters. The word opportunities spelled the same, unusual, incorrect way both in his own private files and in messages, meant to look like they came from a dangerous outsider. It was the kind of detail a person makes without ever realizing it, a fingerprint hidden in plain sight. As investigators sat with this discovery, the entire case shifted beneath their feet. This was not a story about a family targeted by an obsessed stranger. This was something far more calculated. And as they dug deeper into Chris Coleman's life outside that house, detectives were about to uncover a secret that would explain exactly why a devoted husband and father might have wanted his own family gone. With the digital evidence pointing directly back at Chris himself, investigators knew they needed to understand what could possibly drive a father to fabricate months of elaborate threats against his own family. The answer came from an interview conducted hundreds of miles away in Florida with a woman named Tara Lintz. When detectives sat down with her, she did not hesitate to share what had been happening between her and Chris for nearly a year. She described a relationship that had grown far beyond a casual affair. Text messages between the two revealed a couple actively planning a life together. Explicit photos and videos were exchanged during his frequent business trips, which conveniently gave him cover to travel and meet her without raising suspicion. Investigators also uncovered travel receipts, showing the two had taken trips, together disguised as work obligations. Perhaps most damning of all was evidence that Tara had already begun registering for wedding gifts as though marrying Chris was simply a matter of time. According to her own statements to police, Chris had told her directly that he planned to serve Sheri with divorce papers on May 5th, the very same day his wife and two young sons were found strangled inside their home. The timing was not a coincidence. It was a plan. Friends of Sheri later came forward confirming that she had sensed something was deeply wrong in her marriage during those final months. She had confided that she believed Chris wanted out, but felt trapped by fear of losing everything he had built. His prestigious job, protecting one of the most famous religious figures in the country, his reputation within their tight-knit community. A messy public divorce threatened all of that. But murder disguised as a random act of violence, committed by some unknown, obsessed stranger, that would let him walk away with sympathy instead of scandal. It would let him keep his career, his image, and his freedom to start a brand new life with Tara, without anyone ever suspecting the truth. As prosecutors began building their case against him, the picture that emerged was almost impossible to comprehend. Chris had not just been planning an affair. He had spent months constructing an elaborate false narrative, writing his own threatening letters, sending himself frightening emails, all carefully timed to establish a pattern of danger that would make the eventual murders look like the tragic conclusion of a stalking case rather than what they actually were, a calculated act of familicide, designed to erase every obstacle standing between him and the life he wanted with another woman. On May 19th and 20th of 2009, authorities formally arrested Chris Coleman, charging him with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The news sent shockwaves through Colombia and across the country as the story shifted from sympathetic tragedy to something far darker. A trusted head of security, a man who worked for one of the most recognized ministries in America, standing accused of murdering his own wife and children in cold blood. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors assembled an overwhelming body of evidence, built almost entirely on details Chris himself had unknowingly left behind. Cell phone location data placed him near the home during the critical hours surrounding the murders. Despite his claims about the gym, forensic linguists compared his known writing samples to the threatening messages, finding striking similarities in phrasing and style. Handwriting analysts examined the spray-painted messages on the walls looking for any connection back to Chris. And throughout it all, that single distinctive misspelling kept surfacing again and again, tying the supposedly anonymous threats directly back to documents only he could have written. Meanwhile, the defense scrambled to construct an alternative narrative, insisting that Chris was innocent and that some unknown third party had staged the entire scene to frame him. They challenged the reliability of forensic linguistics. They questioned whether digital evidence could truly prove authorship beyond doubt. But piece by piece, the prosecution methodically dismantled every counter-argument, presenting a case built not on speculation but on a trail of digital fingerprints Chris had left scattered across emails, computers, and phone records for months. As opening statements approached in April of 2011, nearly 2 full years after that horrific morning, the town of Columbia braced itself once again. This was no longer just a story about who might have committed an unthinkable crime. Every piece of evidence collected over 2 years of investigation was about to be laid out in front of a jury. Cell tower pings, misspelled words, a secret girlfriend registering for wedding gifts while a family lay dead. And somewhere in that Illinois courtroom, 12 strangers were about to decide whether Chris Coleman would spend the rest of his life paying for what prosecutors believed was one of the most calculated betrayals a father could ever commit against his own children. When the trial finally opened in Waterloo, Illinois, in late April of 2011, the small Monroe County courtroom quickly filled with reporters, family members, and curious spectators who had followed this case for nearly 2 years. Prosecutors began methodically laying out everything investigators had uncovered piece by piece, building a timeline no defense could easily explain away. They walked jurors through the medical examiner's findings, showing that Sheri, Garett, and Gavin had died before 5 in the morning, directly contradicting Chris's account of leaving for the gym around 5:40. They presented the digital trail connecting the threatening emails back to his own laptop, highlighting that same telltale misspelling of the word opportunities appearing in both his personal documents and the supposedly anonymous threats. They brought in cell phone records, placing his phone near the family home during the exact window when the murders were believed to have occurred, despite his insistence that he had already left for his workout. Forensic linguist Dr. Robert Leonard took the stand, explaining the striking similarities between Chris's known writing style and the language used in the threatening letters. Handwriting analyst Lindell Moore testified about comparisons made between the spray-painted messages on the walls and known samples of Chris's own handwriting. And then came the most devastating piece of the puzzle. For many watching the trial unfold, Tara Lintz took the stand, describing in detail the relationship she had carried on with Chris for nearly a year. She spoke about the messages they exchanged, the trips they took together disguised as business travel, the wedding registry she had already begun building, and the chilling detail that Chris had told her directly he intended to serve Sheri with divorce papers on May 5th, the very day his family was found dead. For jurors sitting in that courtroom, the picture being assembled left almost no room for reasonable doubt. This had never been the work of some obsessed stranger stalking the family from the shadows. It was a meticulously planned act, carried out by the one person everyone trusted to protect that home. The defense continued arguing that Chris was innocent, suggesting the evidence had been misinterpreted, and that no one could truly prove who had physically carried out the killings. But standing against a mountain of digital fingerprints, phone records, handwriting, analysis, and testimony from the woman he had been secretly planning a future with, the defense's argument grew harder and harder to sustain with each passing day of testimony. Detective Justin Barlow returned to the stand, describing once more that unsettling morning when he and Chris climbed through the basement window together. He recalled again how Chris never once asked how his family had died. Never asked if they suffered. Never showed the kind of raw, devastated reaction most people expect from someone who just lost everyone they loved in the most violent way imaginable. After weeks of testimony and mounting evidence, the case finally went to the jury. They deliberated for approximately 15 hours, carefully weighing everything that had been presented before reaching their decision. And in a moment that felt almost impossible to comprehend, the verdict was delivered on May 5th, 2011, exactly 2 years to the day since Sheri, Garett, and Gavin had been murdered in their own beds. The jury found Chris Coleman guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. Illinois having abolished the death penalty by that point, the court sentenced him to 3 concurrent life terms, without any possibility of parole, ensuring he would spend the remainder of his life behind bars for the community of Columbia, Illinois. The verdict brought a strange mixture of relief and lingering grief, relief that justice had been served for Sheri and her 2 young sons, but grief that would never fully fade knowing an entire family had been destroyed, not by some external threat, but by the very man who had sworn to protect them. In the years following his conviction, Chris Coleman continued fighting his case through the appeals process. In 2014, the Illinois Appellate Court reviewed his conviction and upheld the jury's decision, confirming that the evidence presented had been more than sufficient to support the verdict. Further appeals and post-conviction petitions followed over the next several years, including one in 2020 that was ultimately denied as well, despite mountains of forensic evidence, a documented affair, and a timeline that never aligned with his own story. Chris Coleman has continued to maintain his innocence in interviews conducted from prison, insisting to this day that someone else was truly responsible for what happened inside that house. The case eventually drew national attention far beyond the borders of Illinois when CBS News featured it in an episode of 48 Hours titled "The Writing on the Wall," bringing renewed public fascination to a story that already had shocked an entire community years earlier. True crime podcasts and documentary style coverage continued, revisiting the case in the years that followed, drawn to the chilling combination of a religious employer, a hidden double, life, and threats that turned out to be entirely self-authored. Many who study cases like this one have since drawn comparisons to other family annihilation, cases where a father chose to eliminate his entire family rather than face the social and financial consequences of walking away through an ordinary divorce. What makes the Coleman case particularly haunting is not just the brutality of what happened inside that home, but the sheer calculation behind it. Months of planning, fake threats carefully crafted to build a narrative long before anyone died. A public image of faith and family loyalty, maintained right up until the moment investigators uncovered the truth hiding beneath it. Sheri Coleman was 31 years old when she died, a devoted mother who built her entire world around her sons. Garett was just 11. Gavin was only 9. 2 young boys who should have had decades of life ahead of them, stolen away by the one person who was supposed to keep them safe, above anyone else in the world. Today, Chris Coleman remains behind bars, serving out 3 life sentences with no possibility of ever walking free again. And while the courts have spoken clearly on what happened in that house on Robert Drive, the deeper question of how someone capable of such devotion on the surface could plan and carry out something this devastating continues to leave people searching for answers that may never fully satisfy anyone left behind. This case stands today as one of the clearest reminders that the most dangerous threats are not always the ones that arrive as anonymous letters or frightening emails from unknown enemies. Sometimes the greatest danger a family will ever face is already living quietly inside their own home. So now it is your turn. After hearing everything that happened to Sheri, Garett, and Gavin, do you think the warning signs were there all along, waiting to be noticed? Or do you think Chris Coleman's plan was simply calculated enough to fool everyone around him until the very end? Tell us what you think in the comments below. And if stories like this one keep you coming back, make sure you are subscribed, because there are many more real cases just like this one waiting to be told right here.